Hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 5 of In the Wider Interests. Hello, I'm Kevin Borras. I am the presenter of In the Wider Interests, the podcast of the fair game movement. And we always explain this on the beginning of every episode, is because people want to hear the podcast and they say, oh, listen to the Fair Game podcast. If you go onto Spotify or Apple Music or whatever and search for Fair Game podcast, you will get a podcast about Scientology. This is not about Scientology. This is about financial fair play and accountability and sustainability in football. So it is called In the Wider Interests. So if you key that into your searches, you will find this podcast and not one about Scientology. Anyway, other religions are, of course, readily available. So today's episode, we are talking to journalists who represent newspapers and the media that are not in the UK. We don't want to use the word foreign. It sounds a bit rude. So we have two guests, two very distinguished guests. So firstly, gentlemen, thank you for your time. Looking forward to this. Our first guest is Tariq Panja. Tariq is a global sports reporter for the New York Times. In 2008, Tariq unearthed some exclusives on FIFA corruption, let's put it that way. And he's also the co-author of a book called Football's Secret Trade, how the football player transfer market was infiltrated. So Tariq, thank you for your time. Looking forward to this.
All right, looking forward to being with you.
And we're also joined by Philippe Auclair. Philippe is a football journalist and author. He works for France Football, for Europe 1, and for a magazine called Yosimar. And also, Philippe is the author of a book called Qatargate, looking into I'm going to say the word dealings into the 2022 World Cup award to Qatar, which all took us by surprise several years ago. So, Philippe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, no, it's going to be interesting. So today, what we're going to talk about, amongst other things, is the European Premier League. We're going to talk about parachute payments, how they work in other countries, if indeed they do work in other countries. We're going to touch on corruption, without mentioning any names, of course, and looking at the fit and proper persons test for directors across Europe. And also, in a time where we are still in the pandemic, money is short in pretty much every industry except football, where we have the two greatest players on the planet at the moment, let's say, and two of the best of all time, Ronaldo and Messi, moving clubs during the same transfer window, which was rather unexpected, I think. And we have discovered, this is no slur on any of these players at all, because I would accept this money. I am told by people who should know this, that the front three of Paris Saint-Germain, which will be, of course, Messi, Neymar and Mbappe, their combined weekly wage, 2.6 million euros a week between the three of them. That's rather a lot of money. When people listening to this, of course, are members of Fair Game, interested in Fair Game, you support non-league teams, you support Newport County. And if you're a Newport County fan, you're looking forward to hopefully getting one of Cardiff's under-23s on loan for the season, and that will make your season. This is a completely different, it's a different sport, isn't it? Anyway, good luck to those players. I'm just jealous of them. So let's go for the European Premier League first. Philippe, as an esteemed author and very well-respected member of the football media in France, what were your thoughts on the European Premier League, and in terms of its sustainability rather than its feasibility?
If we're talking about the European Super League, which, by the way, seems to have been lost now in the midst of time, thanks to all the media attention on the transfer market for obvious reasons. If you're looking at it, I mean, there's so many ways of looking at it. First of all, you've got to start from the financial situation of the clubs which were involved in the project of creating this European Super League. It's been in the offing, by the way, for a very long time. It's not something which suddenly burst out in the open. We were aware some things was going on. In fact, the discussions for this particular project had started 4 or 5 years ago already. And what precipitated everything was the fact that suddenly football, or some part of football, was realizing that it had become simply unsustainable, and the pandemic and the extraordinary financial pressure it put on those clubs meant that they accelerated the processes. And so what you have here is a move that smacks a little bit of desperation from some of the biggest actors in European football, which also happened some of the actors who financially were in the most awful situation. Barcelona, for example, we've all seen what it's led to, the fact that Messi hasn't stayed at the club, for example, but also Italian clubs, I would say in particular, Inter, Milan, Juve were all in dire straits. So it is an attempt for the super elite of European football, which is already in place and has been, in a way, almost ossified by the current Champions League format, to maintain their position, to save what could be saved, and which was presented as an attempt, of course, to save football, extraordinarily enough. I mean, we could go into so many directions here. I mean, there was a fan reaction here, which you shouldn't think was the only reason why the Super League died an ignominious death. It was, of course, on a collision course with UEFA, because it was a direct threat to the UEFA Champions League, which is the biggest earner for the European Confederation. It had, and that's my theory, it is a theory that I'm quite willing to defend, the support or the blessing of FIFA and of Mr. Infantino, who is not against the idea of a Super League, contrary to what he might have said a few times. Okay. The proof of it is that, being that FIFA is trying to precisely start a Super League in Africa. So it's not against the principle at all.
All right.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's a very interesting dossier, actually. And in the end, what we had is basically a conflict of interest between the biggest actors in world football, with the media coming in, with the fans coming in, with the players coming in, and in the end, what looked like the end of the project. But believe me, this project is not here to go, it's here to stay. And it might take other names. It might indeed become another iteration of the Champions League, whose format is already, to be honest, very much like a Super League when you look at it more closely. And the financial problems haven't gone away. So I've probably been too long already. It's actually, it's a fascinating subject, but it's actually even more complicated than that. But that's basically, yes. I mean, like everybody else, I was not surprised at all by the fact that, you know, the Super League suddenly became a thing. I was surprised, caught unawares, perhaps, by the timing of it. And I think everybody was caught unawares, including the people from the Super League themselves.
Yes, also true. Fans of English clubs, or all across English clubs, I'm going to say British clubs, obviously Scotland doesn't like it either, were obviously completely against it. Was that also the case in France? Because people were thinking it's going to ruin the Premier League. If you look a bit closer, that wasn't necessarily going to happen, but it was certainly going to affect our domestic cup competitions. So
it would have affected absolutely everybody, because you need to completely rethink the calendar. And, you know, because we're not talking about a Super League, which is only taking a couple of weekends here and there. We're talking a program of matches which have gone through the whole season. I mean, it's like the whole calendar would have to be thrown out of the window and completely reshaped, which means the collaboration, the cooperation of absolutely everybody. So you can imagine the complications. The response was different. I mean, in various countries. I mean, in Germany, the response was extremely strong as well against it. In France, there were a number of people against it. But in France, the situation was complicated by the fact that one of the main adversaries, or seemingly so, was Paris Saint-Germain, who basically wields so much power in French football at every level, being the French Federation, the French League, and especially the French media, that they were seen, amazingly enough, as the good guys in this context. And that, you know, France, you know, French clubs, the only ones who would have been concerned, and that would have been Olympique de Marseille and PSG, and actually only PSG to start with. So when PSG decided I won't have anything to do, and Bayern Munich did the same thing, by the way, the project was more or less dead in the water, because you can't work without those two guys. But so in France, yes, the reaction was one of what the hell do you think they're doing? But as no French clubs were involved, like, like Liverpool or Manchester City or Chelsea, even if City and Chelsea would rather you forgot about that. The reaction was, this is insane, this is crazy, football's gone bad, the usual. But for reasons which didn't necessarily have to do with the worth of the proposal itself.
Right, got you. Excellent, thank you, Tariq. Then, so how did you, you obviously write for the New York Times, how were you reporting on the brief formation? It was kind of the life of a fruit fly, kind of bursts into life, massive activity, and then dies, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, quite an explosive.
How did you report it? Yeah, and then what was your take on the effects of the Super League on other leagues, particularly in our case the Premier League?
Quite an explosive, when you say short-lived story arc, but very dramatic. It was very interesting and exciting to cover it for all of us, I'd say. But the repercussions it's got a longer tail than the lifespan it had as a concept.
Yeah.
Because it's shone a light on all sorts of areas, and I think an important light on football governance across domestic leagues and particularly at UEFA level. So looking back, I would say on this, there's a reason why I would have thought Paris Saint-Germain, for example, would not want to be in something like this, at least hoping it doesn't happen. Because let's be honest, if this thing was to take off, if we were talking a year or so afterwards, there is not a shadow of doubt that Paris Saint-Germain will want to be part of that.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't these sort of great saviors of European football as you'd want to project if you are them. It's a good moment for them to be seen in that way. But all teams act in self-interest.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was lost, partly this was a real cat-handed launch. It was one of the strangest things I've ever seen. If you think all the clubs that you've mentioned, these large institutions with the public relations operations that they have within them, to do something so badly, it sort of beggars belief. One of the things they failed to explain, the concept completely flawed, a closed European league, abhorrent to most football fans.
Yep.
However, within that, there were some governance elements which I would say are far better than anything UEFA has in place right now. The financial fair play UEFA has is pretty much a laughing stock and has been. It has never been able to properly sanction any of the big clubs, and we'll get into why maybe later on. Within this Super League plan, there were very strict regulations about how you can spend, what you can spend, and how much transparency there will be within that system, something that doesn't exist currently. Now, if you're Paris Saint-Germain, who are able to get away with spending whatever you want, you can look at this summer, for example, you probably will be wary of signing up to something like this, because there's freedom to do whatever you want to amass this group of talent like you've been able to, unhindered, would perhaps be lost. The striking thing is when these people launched their project, they failed to explain any of these benefits. They just looked as what they are, I think, as these cold-hearted businessmen looking to sort of protect their interests. But in doing so, there could have been some other steps into explaining maybe a bit more of the rationale, and they were unable to do that. Looking forwards, I look at it from a governance point of view, and everyone finds this part of the game boring, but it explains why we're in the mess we're in.
Yeah.
UEFA being the kind of white knight here in the aftermath of the collapse of the Champions League, being able to corral governments and fan groups to the fight, maybe getting help, getting people into the streets, certainly in England, has come out looking extremely heroic. But then, you have to look at UEFA's role perhaps in why this has happened. It was unable, and I said that maybe a few seconds ago, to police its own competitions. It's been unable, certainly as far as many people are concerned, to regulate the game as per its own rules. That brings me to this big kind of paradoxical situation in football, and the role of UEFA, and maybe FIFA. You can look at that later. But UEFA is the organizer of this very lucrative football tournament, the Champions League, and in order to make it lucrative, it has to sell broadcasting rights and sponsorship commercial rights to various parties around the world. So when you're trying to organize something like that, you want the best actors in that competition as often as possible, probably. You want the best teams and the best players. That's what you're selling to broadcasters. On the other hand, you've got this important regulatory function for European football. These two things are in collision with each other as far as I'm concerned, because by the letter of the law, the regulator is going to be regulating those actors that they're trying to sell. So the one hand will not want to be regulated. You don't want to kick out your biggest teams or your best players. You're going to do everything in your power in order for that not to happen. So the financial fair play situation, the UEFA licensing mechanism, is already under pressure from before they begin because of this. And a result, as far as I can see, we've seen the largest actors get away with perhaps flouting the rules. And that brings me to the next question. Is it time that you break UEFA up into constituent parts that are independent of each other, or even an outside party organizes the club competitions? Not saying Super League with these bunch of 12 teams running away with everything is the answer, but would there not be a case then for an outside group, an outside body to organize the event and then be regulated by somebody else whose whole reason to be is to be the regulator, no favorites and no favors? That's the question that for me has emerged from this mess.
Yeah.
Can I just bounce back on what Tariq was just saying here? Also, we should remember that when it happened, the whole Super League thing, UEFA at the same time put in place a reform of the Champions League, a new format which is going to be introduced in a few years' time, which in itself is going to create a de facto Super League, but within the Champions League format. The first thing. Second thing is that financial fair play was also de facto suspended during the pandemic, and the whole lot, everything's going to be withdrawn by UEFA before the end of the year. How exactly, we don't know. And again, for UEFA, the good guys, we shouldn't forget that while this was happening, at the same time, they decided to give an under-19 women's competition to Belarus at the time when the Belarusian regime was cracking down on dissidents, and actually, well, I wouldn't call them dissidents, people who are simply pro-democracy protesters. So this is just to put UEFA's white knight in shining armor, to put it on the right kind of horse.
Yeah, it's, well, let's come to that's a good point. Your investigations in your book, looking at Qatar and how Qatar got the World Cup. Let's just put it in simple terms. Can we talk about that briefly? Because that was always extraordinary. When America got the World Cup in '94, people were always like, "How they don't even have a league?" And of course, America had to create a league before to get the World Cup. Okay, we'll create a league. So they started. Is it a year after, 2 years after? But Qatar getting it is this. Well, there's no football history in Qatar. Let's be fair. That's true. The human rights issue, we can cover that. And you think, well, it's purely. It's down to cash, isn't it? So I'm not trying to sum your book up that it's down to money, no, but can we talk about how, if we're talking about fair play and sustainability and accountability and responsibility, how did Qatar get next year's World Cup? And then, of course, having it in the winter is also the issue.
Every single of the points you've raised, we could talk for days. And actually, in fact, Tariq and I and many others have been doing that since the process started.
Well, we'll do an episode purely about the World Cup.
Well, yes, but I would say, rather than go into all that, that you have got to see the award of the World Cup to Qatar as a systemic failure from FIFA. rather than go to the particulars, and we've gone into that at great length, and I think the people who are listening to us are able to read what we've written about that, all the suspicions, all the dangerously, what would be the word? I mean, all the times that we've been very close to the curb and actually gone over it. But it's a systemic failure. Qatar is not the first country to host a World Cup after a bid and a process that was tainted. It was the case for Germany. It was the case for South Africa. It's been the case for a very, very long time. Indeed, we should remember that the host was chosen by the most corrupt group of football executives probably ever assembled in Zurich. Doesn't mean they've all gone and it's much better today, but it was certainly a high watermark in a very kind of old school kind of corruption, whose heroes now are, most of them, either dead or in jail or should be in jail or under investigation and so forth. It was the dirtiest bidding process of all time. Let's not forget that Russia 2018 was also involved in that. And that actually nobody, and I think Tariq would agree with me on this one, apart from perhaps the Belgian Netherlands bid, and perhaps the Japanese Korean bid, was totally above reproach in what was happening. This was very much the consequence of a systemic failure, and which encouraged, and when I say encouraged, and sometimes created, provoked corruption within the instance, and not just money corruption, political corruption, at every bloody stage, at every stage of the bidding process. So rather than looking at Qatar on its own, which is fascinating, we have to look at it as a complete failure of world football to govern itself. And I come back to what Tariq was saying about UEFA, that the solution here, perhaps here, is to break down FIFA, as actually a couple of people within FIFA are thinking, perhaps not Mr. Infantino, between the governing body, the rule maker, the tournament organizer, and even the commercial enterprise, and of course, the Department of Justice, because FIFA is also the body which gives out sanctions and is supposed to look after the integrity of the game. So there you go.
Thanks, Philippe. I think that is definitely an episode in waiting, or maybe a series in waiting, looking at Qatar. One thing I want to touch on, I don't know if this is one of those things where you think, I write about football, I broadcast about football. Maybe I don't know as much as I think I do. We're talking about parachute payments in all of our episodes so far. This is episode 5. And parachute payments, for those maybe even not aware of it, if you're listening from other countries, when clubs are relegated from particularly the Premier League into the Championship, they get, I think it's something like 25 million quid. It's ridiculous amounts of money, which is to help them the following season to stay afloat, stay alive. What of course it means is the players who are on 80 grand a week but didn't perform that season, they can still be on 80 grand a week and help your club get back up the leagues, which is why it's fair. Norwich City do this every season. We know, if you're an English football fan, you know full well Norwich go down. I reckon they'll go down this season. And I would put money on them coming back up next season. That's how they survive. That's, if we had the chairman of Norwich on here, or if you had Delia Smith on, and you ask them the question, what is your business model going up and going down, is probably how that works. It also works in other leagues. When Sunderland in League One for the 4th season, they got a massive parachute payment. It helped them hugely to the point where they're in League One, in the same division as Accrington Stanley and Morecambe and Mighty Mouse of Wimbledon, who are on tiny little budgets compared to them. They're still paying players in the £30,000-40,000 a week bracket, and good luck to those players. Well done for them. It just creates a completely uneven playing field, literally. So I'm going to come to Philippe. Are parachute payments, as we call them, are they a factor in French football, German football, Spanish football? Is it one of those unique, bizarre things that English football does?
Yes, it is. A bizarre, unique thing. And in fact, it's something that I have to do every year when we start a new season and I cover it for a French media. and I have to explain what parachute payments are, and people look at me and think, really? And yes, I mean, to be honest, it's not my specialist subject, and it might be there's some kind of compensation elsewhere, but that type of parachute payments, and especially the size of them and the fact that they have obviously an impact on the competitivity of the championship is something which is absolutely unique, and which many people, but this being said, it is also completely unique because the Premier League in itself is completely unique. The Premier League, and again, many people are not aware of that. Premier League is a limited company with 20 shareholders, plus one, the golden share from the FA, but the FA doesn't take, it's not part of the day-to-day running. It's only there to guarantee the integrity of the competition and to look at the competitive framework. So that's already very unique. The other leagues are not necessarily constituted that way as a limited company. Then the very strange relationship that the Premier League has got with the Football League is also something which is very unique, because, Bundesliga, you've got Bundesliga 1 and Bundesliga 2, 2. In French, the LFP is actually not just, Ligue 1, it's the Ligue de Football Professionnel. And we carry on like that. So it is quite unique. And it is very interesting, actually, for me, seeing it from the outside, that the system hasn't been called out for what it was more regularly. Now, when a club is relegated, very often there are contractual clauses in the players' agreements, which means that their salaries are not quite as high. If the clubs have done their job properly, which they don't always do. But the unbalance it creates in the championship, and the proof of that is simply by looking at who goes down, who goes up. And the proportion of clubs which bounce back immediately is remarkably high compared to other countries, remarkably high. And it has an unbalancing effect on the whole pyramid, as a matter of fact. But the system is also, as I believe, being not rethought, but there is a process of evaluation being carried on at the moment. And perhaps looking as well at the amount of money which is going down to those clubs, which creates a completely uneven competitive field. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you can afford, when you receive millions, tens of millions in parachute payments, and you compare your lot with a team that's just been promoted from League One, well, how can you even compete?
Yeah. But it's the same, I guess, everywhere. I was reading something yesterday that a fan, a German football journalist, had said he'd spoken to a fan of RB Leipzig, and said they're obviously the second most successful team in Germany the last couple of years, budget-wise, pretty decent, and they've lost their manager, but centre half and centre midfield player, to the only team in Germany better than them. He said, what other league you wouldn't have 3 Man United players, 2 of them, and the manager going to Man City? You wouldn't have that in. So every league has its own issues. I don't support any of the team. I have one team. I don't have favourite teams in other countries. However, I do have a link with Angers in France. So I look at Angers results.
Doing quite well at the moment.
They are. This is my point. Angers are currently second in the French in League. But we all know they ain't going to win the league. I mean, the fact Lille won it last year was extraordinary. PSG have reacted to, we can't let Lille win again, by picking up Donnarumma, Ramos, Wijnaldum, Hakimi and Messi. You think, okay, well, you're probably going to win the league again this year. So if you are a team like Angers, what can you actually expect in the course of a season? If they finish second, that's extraordinary. That's better than winning the league, because it's almost not going to happen. I guess every league has that. But it'd be for us. It'd be like Bournemouth.
I think you've got Ligue 1 is a caricature, but careful here, because if I look at who's won the French league recently, Montpellier won it when PSG was already Qatari. Monaco won it. Lille won it. And when you compare that with what's happened in Italy, for example, or even Germany, you realize that actually there is an imbalance in French football, which is, it's just so insane in French football. that people look at it because of the headlines and so forth. But you can be. That's the paradox. Is actually Ligue 1 is probably for me more exciting at the moment than it's been for quite a while. Actually, the first rounds of this season have been absolutely terrific. Unfortunately, we had the Nice incidents, but otherwise the football has been great. And also there is a perception that teams down tools. And you probably edit all of this because it's something that has annoyed me when I saw the coverage of the Reims PSG game on Sunday night, when obviously people were focusing on the fact that some Reims fans were singing Messi, 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 which is not something you necessarily are too keen to hear. And the fact that the commercial director of Stade de Reims was even saying, commenting before the game that it would be great to hear the stadium shout, singing Messi, Messi, Messi. Okay, all right. I watched the game and Stade de Reims gave a really good performance against PSG. And it's not because they shared a selfie after the game, starstruck, the keeper, that they didn't play their hearts out. And which is very much what Ligue 1, for those who actually watch it, is. It's not a farmers' league. It's not as bad as people say it is. PSG is crushing it. PSG, in a way, has put the other clubs in a state of not serfdom, but vassaldom, by making them believe that somehow they would benefit from the largesse but all this money would somehow trickle down. We know where the trickle-down effect is in economics. Everybody will tell you it doesn't exist, it doesn't happen. But they are hanging on to this idea, and they're hoping that we are able, this way we're going to be able to sell the rights to foreign broadcasters more easily. Now we've got Messi and all these guys in, which, by the way, that much is probably true. If you look at the viewing figures in Spain for that particular game, they were very high indeed. But this is again to say that, yes, PSG is a club that is totally makes its own rules. All the easier when you have a chairman who is a minister without portfolio of Qatar, who has got key roles at UEFA, ECA, beIN Sport, LFP. I probably forget a few there. So yes, it's completely ridiculous when you look at it. But that doesn't mean, and this is the end of my rant, and feel free to edit this out.
No, this is going
that Ligue 1 is without interest. Angers is great to look at. Clermont-Ferrand is promoted, is wonderful to look at, and is a very interesting sports project, actually. So you shouldn't reduce French football to PSG. But that's the problem, because PSG is there. Outside, people reduce it to PSG, with perhaps a word or two for Marseille or Lyon, when things go a bit better for them. That's a real problem. Sure. And again, apologies for the length of this rant, but it really annoyed me because I really enjoyed that Reims PSG game. I really enjoyed the way that Reims had a go at them until the very last second, despite posing for selfies afterwards.
Yeah, I get it. I understand with the goalkeeper. Anyway, I get that. But did Stade de Reims, I should pronounce it properly, do they not play in one of the early European Cup finals?
Well, they played 2 European Cup finals, and what happened then was exactly what is happening these days, is that they had one of the best players in the world at the time called Raymond Kopa, and of course, what did Real Madrid do? They bought Raymond Kopa. Nothing, and Real Madrid, in a way, were really ahead of their time when they had Puskás, Gento, Di Stefano, Kopa put together, as a forward line. They were doing exactly the thing that you were saying that Bayern is doing to the others, and that PSG is doing to the others. That's exactly the same. But Reims is twice European Cup finalist and should have won it on one occasion, by the way.
I'm trivializing this. Did they play at Hampden Park in one of those games? They lose 7-3 to Real Madrid, was that right?
No. You're thinking of Eintracht Frankfurt here, I think. One of the finals may have been played in Scotland, but to be honest, I wasn't at the game. I wasn't born then, so maybe Tariq knows the answer.
Neither was I. I think
no idea.
No, I think we'll move on from any comments about age in here. But Tariq, then, what's the view then of the Premier League and how the Premier League operates in other parts of the world? Then obviously you're a global sports reporter. Your title.
It's extremely popular. It's one of the, look, taken in isolation, overseas, this is one of Britain's best exports by far. So, for example, whenever there's a trade mission in recent years, wherever the Prime Minister's plane goes on one of these trade missions, there is often a representative of the Premier League there. It's one of the best calling cards for the United Kingdom. Hugely popular domestic league, partly to do with Britain's colonial history. So those sort of roots are already planted in many parts of the world. And yeah, aside from that, it's a massive cash generator as well. There isn't any other league that's comparable really for size and reach as far as football's concerned. So to go back to the start of the conversation, that was another one of the rationales for the European Super League. La Liga, Serie A, whoever, you name it, they've tried and pretty much given up to try and compete on a sort of toe-to-toe as we can somehow match this behemoth. And you can see it from transfer spending. FIFA put a report out this week on a decade of transfer market activity. Staggering amount has been spent in the world. I think $45 billion over the last decade, something like that. And, by far the biggest spenders in that marketplace have been Premier League teams. It's attracted global talent and attracted global eyeballs. And it has been a success story from that point of view. But, to your point, one of the most basic things that we need to break down here is, what is a football team for? Is it to generate as much money as possible? For some of these owners, that seems to be it. We're talking about football being in crisis because of the pandemic, etc. We had Agnelli, the Juventus president, often talking about new markets, raising revenues, etc., in order to keep football sustainable. But no one seems to be talking about cost. So for me, the most basic, it's a very simple calculation. Football businesses aren't very complicated at all. Football teams running them. You have two cost centers, how much you're paying to sign football players, and two, how much you're paying them in salaries. Now, if these things keep going up, that's your fault. There's no one else to blame. There's an industry, there's another system failure as far as I'm concerned. And everyone say, well, in order to fix this, we need to find new revenue streams. And I'll be like, well, not really. Surely you need to rationalize how much you're spending. And this comes again, football clubs in isolation, they're competing with one another. They don't trust each other. So, well, look, I'd love to spend less, but then if I spend less, the team up the road is going to spend more and get all the best players. So again, you come down to this very boring, but extremely important part of the game, which is regulation and governance. One of the things that UEFA is looking to do to replace its financial fair play mechanism that they'll say has succeeded. In some ways it has, in order to reduce indebtedness at teams across Europe, but has done nothing to improve competitive balance, is this idea of a luxury tax, which is borrowed from Major League Baseball, where there are caps, and UEFA will introduce these caps, call it a salary cap, call it a cap on how much of your revenue, whatever, you can spend. If you exceed that, you have to pay a luxury tax, and that tax, as far as the baseball series, Major League Baseball goes, is then distributed to your rivals. I see major flaws in this, to be honest with you, in terms of competitive balance. You're asking teams that are owned by entire nations, Qatar in the case of Paris Saint-Germain, or United Arab Emirates in the case of Manchester City, to pay a tax on any players or any costs that they bear beyond a certain salary cap. Of course, they'll say they'll be fine for them, because this football business. The numbers we're talking about might seem astronomical, and they are, but in the context of countries spending, part of their total global spending, it's nothing. So if you're saying to PSG or Man City, would you mind paying a tax in order to remain the best teams in the world's most popular sport? I'm sure they'll bite your hand off.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're going to see. And then they're saying we're going to calculate this tax based on your revenue. For me, UEFA has not proven itself to be very good at being able to calculate what is the correct revenue, because some of these teams have been able to inflate their revenue streams by accessing sponsorships, etc., from their parent countries.
Yeah,
and that's not been prevented. So I think the jury's out. But as far as football teams are concerned, again, we have to get back to basics. What are they for? Are they for a community? Are they for this? Are they global billboards? Are they calling cards for nations? What is it that we want our football teams to be? And I think that is a conversation we need to have at, certainly in the UK at government level, and beyond that at the European Union level. There should be some protections as to who can own them, why they should own them, what they should be used for, because otherwise they are just hawking goods, doing all these other things, money-making schemes that extend well beyond the football field. Most things like the game on Saturday or Wednesday, whenever it is, or Tuesday, is just almost an irritation for some of these enterprises.
Yes, that's a good point. We'll come back to the financial fair play and fit and proper people in a minute. George has done some research. Thank you, George. George says that Stade de Reims got to 2 European Cup finals, both against Real Madrid, lost them both, one in Paris, one in Stuttgart. I was wrong about Hampden Park because that was indeed Real Madrid against Frankfurt. That was a 7-3, wasn't it? So thank you. Philippe, you were also correct. I'm wrong on every count. But at least they got to the finals. That's handy. Pleased about that. So let's stay with you, Tariq, for a bit then. So the idea of the fit and proper people test, which you have to undergo if you are looking to buy or invest in or become a director of a large football club, a professional football club, which we are discussing on various different episodes of this podcast, doesn't seem to be worth the paper it's printed on, if it indeed is still printed on paper. When you look at what happened at various clubs, at Bury, we've been talked about before. Oldham, we had Natalie Atkinson, previously a director of Oldham, on our director special, and she was saying, I can't talk about what went on at Oldham, but there is a storm coming, and the storm did happen when their fans invaded the pitch. And you can understand, we can't condone fans going onto the pitch, but in that case, they were doing it to protest about the owners of their club ruining their club and potentially losing it. You can understand that. And look at how Derby and Wigan and Sheffield Wednesday, their owners were involved in some very interesting financial dealings. So how does the fit and proper person test in terms of directors and owners, how does that work out in other countries?
Well, I think, to be fair, I think England probably has the most stringent of those, and that probably tells you it's just a very murky world, the world of football. This is global figures traversing a global sport, moving cash around the world, and you're asking essentially a football body to monitor who these people are. I think it's an unenviable task. Some are able to do it better than others, but also I think where there was recently an Al Jazeera documentary on this, and it shone a light on the various workarounds and the specialists that you can buy for top dollar in order to get you around this. There are people who, whether it's a football team or any other type of business, unfortunately, this is part of the UK PLC. It seems to be up for sale to whoever wants to buy whatever it wants here, and in any way they want. The UK allows shadow directors, nominee directors, all sorts of schemes and mechanisms and trusts, blind trusts, etc. For anyone who wants to buy something and who has the cash to do it, there are ways to work the system. And in fact, it's one of the UK's service businesses. This is another way the UK makes money. So it's not really, I would say, a football problem. This is a British problem. This is the type of economy we want, the type of services we like to provide, not just here to people in the UK, around the world. Our ability to mask ownership is perhaps unsurpassed. We know all the tricks of the trade, and we export that.
Yeah.
And then as far as football goes, look, it's very hard to ask the EFL to say, can you figure out who this Chinese businessman is?
Yeah.
And that would involve the EFL having to spend a great deal of resource trying to find how this man or this company operates in somewhere as opaque and impenetrable as China. And we've seen what's happened.
Yeah.
There's been, you know, nightmare scenarios across the board, not only with China. I remember the famous story of Portsmouth, you know, very sad story that ended up with Portsmouth essentially going down the divisions as owner after owner. You know, it was in bankruptcy court. And there was one fellow, Ali Al-Siraj, this Saudi Arabian guy who no one had heard of. He just sort of emerged. I think he was one of the debtors, and they weren't even sure he was a real person. You know, I understood at the Premier League headquarters, he had a nickname, Ali Al-Mirage. They just weren't sure who he was. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about domestic football and these global players, arms dealers, murky Chinese businessmen, whoever, all trying to gravitate to this. Then you've got to ask yourself, why is football so attractive to this people, to a lot of these people? Yeah. It might be the fact that it's unaccountable and there is so much opacity in the industry.
Well, my local non-league team, I'm about a mile away from where they used to play, Croydon Athletic. They were used as a money laundering front for the guys that were involved with the Pakistani cricket spot fixing scandal. Yeah. And the club folded because of that. I mean, it's bizarre and it's an extraordinary situation, but I'm not making light of it at all. So I always come back to the same subject of fan ownership. Obviously, I support AFC Wimbledon. We are owned by, before someone tells me off, we're owned by the Dons Trust. I was owned by the fans. It's actually, strictly speaking, we're owned by a trust, but we are fan owned. Now, the model works really well for us. It doesn't work for other clubs. I understand that. There are other clubs that have tried fan ownership and have sold back to people. In Germany, of course, you've got the 50+1 rule, where no one person can own controlling shares of a football club. So if
it's the voting rights, it's not quite the same. It's not quite the same. Yeah,
but it ensures that, I guess, in some cases, the rich man's plaything, terrible phrase, they get bored of it. It's in fan ownership that doesn't happen because we're owned by, George, we about 3,600, something like that. People who own our club. One person did put a lot of money in, but he was a fan. So if he withdrew his money, we'd have a bit of an issue. But it's not the controlling interest. We haven't got an Abramovich or an Al Maktoum who's put billions of pounds in. We all own some of the club. Does the fan ownership model that we have, is that talked about in Europe as a potential way of regulating football, making it more sustainable, more accountable to itself?
First of all, there are countries in which this is the system in place. Norway is one. Sweden is another. Germany, the picture is actually much more complicated than it appears at first.
Okay.
Because there are big exceptions, such like people will know about Wolfsburg, people will know about Bayer Leverkusen, but it's also for clubs like RB Leipzig, of course, which is one of the reasons why they're so hated in Germany. But Hoffenheim, there are regulations, in fact, which mean that it is possible for a club to be the thing of a big investor. And if you look at the case of Bayern, you will look at the shareholding, and this is where you realize that shareholding and voting rights are not the same thing at all. So the German situation is a bit more complicated. What I find very interesting is, in many ways, the English football, and I might surprise you when I say that to you, when it comes to football cultures where fan ownership is not a thing, is actually ahead of many countries. It's ahead of Italy. It's ahead of Spain, regardless of the so-called socis system, which is, again, not quite what it seems. It's very much ahead of Portugal. It's ahead of France. And what I find very interesting is that it's a model, I think at the moment, 56 clubs which I would call professional, semi-professional in England, are controlled directly or indirectly by fan trusts. That's a lot. It used to be about nil. Mm-hmm. And it's a model that's got legs. If you see what's happening in Lewis, for example, which I think is a model club in many, many ways. And it's something which unfortunately is not happening in other countries.
Right.
There is the sense, and I'm very interested. I'm not saying that England is a model in that. I just feel that there is some kind of movement, supporters-led movement in England, which is going up a little bit stronger season per season, very often because the clubs don't have any other they don't have any other solution, because the club has died because of the awful owners they've had, and they've had to rebuild from scratch. But this model, yes, I mean, I think if you look at it, it's one possible model that can actually gain ground. And using, as I said, the strongholds, which are Scandinavia, and up to a degree, Germany. And maybe England can show the example of a country which traditionally is where clubs are not owned by fans, and which slowly is evolving towards that. At the moment, maybe Tariq would probably correct me, but there used to be, I mean, of course, Swansea was the big exception in the Premier League at one point.
Yeah.
At the moment, which clubs? I mean, is it Norwich? They still, I mean, maybe this has to be edited out, because there are still a couple of clubs, I think, where fans own
there's
part of shareholding.
Depends what you count as well. If you mean you count like maybe Steve Parish, it could be. If you remember when Crystal Palace was on the wall, it was him and a few mates, and obviously that now is developed into a different type of model with the Americans investing in the club, etc., and the value of the business increasing, and Steve Parish, if he was to sell out, probably at quite a large profit, but the will at the time from Parish and Co was there to save the club. But it just depends on what we talk about. I know Philippe mentioned this. It's not the same, but a lot of people in Britain, they look at this misty-eyed at the Barcelona and Real Madrids and Benfica and member-owned. But I actually, having sort of studied these and having seen the various machinations that take place behind the scenes of these places, I'm not sure that's much better than an owner model at all, to be honest. And there's a couple of reasons why. There's such a lack of accountability at these clubs. They've had Porto, for example, has the same president for nearly 4 decades. Mm-hmm. Barcelona is in a total financial meltdown here, partly because I think it's really easy to spend money that's not yours. Yeah. If you diffuse like the risk across so many people, you start, and your organization is a political organization where your president is being elected. It's kind of like pork barrel politics. Let's promise the world every election time, put the business or the business of the club at huge risk, sign whoever you want, even though you can't afford them, and then come what may, I'll be, worst thing that happens is that the president leaves, but leaves an absolute dumpster fire for whoever takes his place, and that guy's probably going to promise the world as well. And the other part of this, for me, a big, at the top level, the big part of the industry, these transfers, aren't they? Transfers and salaries and negotiations. Now, one thing that I'm really aware of is there are some deals that really don't make any sense from a sporting perspective. Millions of euros, pounds that are moving around, we're talking about Europe, millions of euros. And you look at relationships between, say, these so-called sporting directors and agents, etc. You think, God, why has this happened? This is not good for the club, but it does foster these really curious and really troubling relationships between actors in football who seem to be moving around between clubs. And when there isn't a man or a company whose money is at stake, who's really looking at every penny, I think that leads to some really dangerous and dark places for the industry. Philippe, would you agree with some of that?
Yeah, I would agree. And I was going to take a completely shocking example. I think one of the best run clubs in England is Chelsea Football Club. Genuinely. I'm not talking about the Abramovich model, or I'm not saying that he's a wonderful person, all these sort of things. But I look at the way they conduct their business. I think, my goodness, that's pretty damn clever. They are now balancing their books. They really are. You know, they've done this summer. They've been remarkably clever. The excesses of the early part of their history or their new history have been not forgotten about, but they're a thing of the past. They've got a very strong management team in place. I'm thinking, okay, I'd like to feel a bit easier as to where the money initially came from, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But when it comes to the functioning of it, I don't have a particular problem with it. I have a big problem with Real Madrid, for example, and Mr. Florentino Perez, who has, because the other thing that, I mean, Tariq was actually suggesting it, is the fact also that, for example, at Barcelona, it's not because you're a member that you can vote, because there are gradations in your shares. Just the same way, by the way, that Manchester United have got A shares and B shares. You see, the model can cut across the socio model. Mm-hmm. In Madrid, you've got a president in place who has basically put in a protocol for people who wanted to be candidates against him, which means that basically only he can stand.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah, you have to be fabulously wealthy to challenge him, right, Philippe?
Oh yeah, it's a personal guarantee. And which runs in the hundreds of millions of euros. So it's a bit difficult for, Jose Blogs to decide I'm going to be a candidate for the presidency of Real Madrid, because where are your 273 million euros bank guarantee, my friend?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more than that. And it's again, it's the system. Sorry, let me take that again and shut up. But the single owner model is not a bad thing in itself. You can then discuss whether it would be a good thing to have fan representation on board meetings, if you should open the shareholding to fans, all these sort of things, which probably would be great. The problem for me is transparency. As always, as Tariq was saying, I mean, there are very few businesses which are as opaque as football is. You have to look again, for example, this report that FIFA just did on international transfers. Now, FIFA has got all the figures to the penny of every single transfer. They've got all the contracts. They know how much players are paid. They know the bonuses. They know the exact amount of the transfer deals. Well, look at the FIFA report. You won't see any precise figure in there. You will see over 100 million, under 100 million. So you can sort of guess what some of the transfer fees were, or what they're paid, or what the players are paid. But there is such a reluctance to have transparency, which is amazing. We seem to be importing from the US all that's worth about the professional sports and forget about what's best about the way they actually run their sports in America, i.e. transparency.
Excellent. That's a very good place to end, Philippe. Thank you very much indeed for that. Excellent stuff. Philippe, thank you very much indeed for your time. Tariq, thank you very much for your time. We've come to the end of our allotted time slot. If you want to know more about Fair Game, it's fairgameuk.org. Philippe and Tariq, we've discussed some very interesting things. We've said interesting things. I've heard a lot of stuff I didn't know. Been corrected on a couple of things. It's always a good sign I get stuff wrong on a podcast. But I want to end on something more jolly. Not that it wasn't jolly, but it's quite deep in there. What are each one of you, one of your favourite anecdotes from your time in football media over the years?
Oh my God.
If you can pick only one that you can repeat on a podcast.
Well, that's the problem.
That is the problem. Yeah, most of mine I can't actually repeat either. Have it while you're thinking. Tariq, anything come to mind?
You've really put us on the spot here.
I have. I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This for so long. Hang on, let me.
If it doesn't involve Peter Ridsdale, that's even better. Because our last three.
I think my favorite moment, and I'm going to sound like a real groupie here, but really the one thing, it's 3 days I spent in a club which is not my club with the player that I don't necessarily like. When Cristiano Ronaldo was Ballon d'Or in 2008, and I spent 3 days with him and Sir Alex Ferguson in Manchester.
Right.
And it completely transformed because we were there basically all of the time, like including in his home, having dinner with him and family and so forth, and going to lunch together and being with him when he was shooting an ad and interviewing him at length, taking the plane with him to go to Paris with Mummy and everybody. And it completely changed the way I looked at him. And then I looked at professional footballers, even though he's probably in the category of his kind, he lives in a different galaxy from all other footballers.
Yeah.
But those 3 days were such an extraordinary eye-opener into how a player works, how a manager works, how an agent works, because of course Jorge Mendes was around all of the time. And dynamics at work with the family and so forth. It was absolutely fascinating. And I've been dining out on it ever since. And it was 13 years ago.
Well, it's not like he's gone away and he's been out of the news in that time. It's like that's a great story. I like that. Yeah, getting different perceptions of people it's good, isn't it? Sometimes it's disappointing. Oh no, I didn't like him. Like you end up really liking somebody. Tariq, have you had time to think of?
I have. But not as well, it's just more about rivalry. I mean, sometimes I lived in Brazil for a little while, and early days there, the football team was very excited about going to be involved in was but I didn't know how it worked, so I didn't know the intensity of some of these games. I went to see Flamengo play Corinthians at the Maracanã.
Right.
It wasn't a normal league game, not a huge crowd, but I wanted to write a piece on Corinthians and their supporters, and I tried to sort of go with their fans. And what I didn't realize is how much they hated Palmeiras, which play in green. And that day I had these green trainers on, and as I was going in, they demanded I just remove my shoes. I had to attend that game in socks. And that's one of the things about covering this wonderful game of ours. It takes all sorts. There's so many different rivalries, so many different hotlines that you can't keep on top of all of them. It's probably the first and only time so far that I've had to sort of cover a game only wearing my socks. But I think I had to return home in socks, so I think they got rid of my shoes.
That's great. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed so much. No, just walking through Brazil, walking through Rio with you in socks. That's great. That's lovely. Anyway, so Philippe, Tariq, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really enjoyed this. If you want to know more about Fair Game, fairgameuk.org. Join us for episode 6 very, very shortly, where we'll be speaking to members of the British media about just how sustainable and accountable and feasible British football can be. My name's Kevin Borras. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.